again. Today we're going to talk about something quite unique and different. I think you'll find it interesting. We're going to talk about the prophet's experience, what it was like to be a prophet and to go through that whole process of receiving a prophecy and giving that prophecy out to other people as God had commanded you to do. And that's a topic that no one else has looked at that I know of. So we're going to ask, what was it like to be a prophet? And we're going to focus particularly on what was it like to get that message? Now, we know the prophets had a rough life many times. They were treated very badly, killed sometimes, all sorts of bad things like that. We're not going to deal with that. We're only really going to talk about the experience of receiving a prophecy and delivering a prophecy. And, and this is really an important thing to understand because it relates to whether or not we can trust that a prophet correctly relayed exactly what God gave him. Are we reading, when we read the Bible prophecies, are we reading the exact words of God, or is this something that the prophet has had an opportunity to put his own opinion into or his own ideas into? So it's important to us to understand and to have that trust that the prophet really has relayed exactly what God gave to him. And we'll deal with that as we see some examples here. And it's also important in understanding what a prophecy says, and that's kind of a surprising thing. What the prophecy says is related to the way that it gets delivered to the prophet and gets delivered to written on paper or to people. So if you read the Old Testament prophets carefully and thoughtfully, and you look at that way, you can see that the prophets themselves had trouble describing the experience of receiving a prophecy. And part of this is that in our normal lives, that isn't something that happens. You don't receive a prophecy from God like that. And so they would use whatever words kind of made sense to them to describe this experience. And we're going to look at that from Isaiah particularly. But if you look at all the other prophets, they have very similar starts to their prophecies that describe this, how a prophecy got to me that they describe. And a big part of that is that we just don't have language words to describe such things. We don't have a word to describe something just showed up and here it was a prophecy for me to deliver. So we'll see that from Isaiah. And Isaiah says, the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So he doesn't mean that he saw words, because this is a written prophecy. There is no symbolism or anything like that he describes. It is a written prophecy. It's just words. And it doesn't mean that he saw words in front of his eyes. He means perceived. He means understood, or he became aware of, or just suddenly it was there and he knew it was there. And when we see him say word, the word is what he says there is, he means the message, everything that was in this message that he's now delivering in the written form in Isaiah chapter 2. And so his experience is that he perceived this message, this whole bunch of words, and what he's writing down on the page now is that exact message. And so we can see that something has happened within him. All of a sudden, he became aware of, or he understood this whole lengthy message. And Isaiah's prophecies, as you know, some of them are on the short side, but a lot of them are fairly lengthy prophecies. And so this whole message has become something that's part of him or inside of him. And so today we might say God downloaded a message into his memory, but that's the exact thing that the prophet is wrestling with himself. He says the word saw. Other prophets use different words than saw, but they have the same kind of idea, is suddenly it was just there and in my memory and it was there. And we don't have words in English or any other language to express that whole idea. Suddenly it was just there from the prophet's perspective. And those could be very long prophecies as well. I mentioned that a bit earlier, but for John's revelation, it appears that is 22 chapters of beasts and heads and horns and all the other stuff that John talks about in Revelation. And so that whole thing was dumped into his memory in the same way it was for the Old Testament prophets. So that was the experience of receiving that prophecy. And that is mentioned even more here. That download, it was a permanent download into their memories. It wasn't something that they had memorized, but it was as though they had memorized it. But it was just stuck in their memory. If you remember, maybe you can remember back to your school days, and you may have learned some rhymes or something like that, and or some poetry perhaps, and you memorize that yourself. And even today, maybe you can remember that if you think about it a little bit. And so it was much the same way. These prophets wouldn't ever have to memorize this. It was just downloaded into their brains, but it's there. It's there permanently, and it's there. They can access that anytime and read or think through, read. Yeah, here we are again, not having words for this, is they can see this prophecy again that they were given long before. And we have some good examples from Jeremiah about that idea that the prophecy was downloaded permanently into them. And Jeremiah, in his case, he had been given many prophecies to deliver in person to various people. And then later on, I think it's chapter 36, where God tells him, okay, I want you to write all this stuff down. And he goes to his scribe, and his scribe writes down what Jeremiah dictates to him. And here's the verses that talk about that. In the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, this word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, take a scroll and write on it all the words which I have spoken to you concerning Israel and concerning Judah and concerning all the nations, from the day I first spoke to you, from the days of Josiah, even to this day. Then Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote on a scroll at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord which he had spoken to him. So what happens there is that God says, okay, I want you to write all this stuff down. You've delivered all these prophecies that I gave you from way, way back, and now I want you to write them all down. And Jeremiah has all of those prophecies in his memory still. And that's what he does. He goes to Baruch and says, Baruch, you're a scribe. I'll employ you to write all these things down for me. And Baruch does that. And Jeremiah dictates all of these prophecies that he has received over a very long period of time. They're all still rock solid in his memory. And so he can do word for word dictation from what he has in his memory. And also with Jeremiah, there's a second example of that. And that is that later the king gets a hold of these prophecies that have been written down. He doesn't approve of them at all. They're saying exactly the thing he doesn't want to hear prophetically. And so he cuts up the scroll into pieces and burns each piece one by one. And so the scroll is completely destroyed. And as a result of that, Jeremiah has to dictate the whole thing again. All of what we now know as Jeremiah is dictated to Baruch a second time, and Baruch writes it down, and it comes to us through history that way. So we see two examples there of the longevity of the prophecy in the memory of the prophet. When God downloads it, it's there and it's stuck there word for word. It can be dictated multiple times. And that just kind of makes sense too, because in many cases the prophecies weren't meant to be written down, but they were meant to be delivered to multiple people. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But what God always seems to be doing is, if a prophecy was to be written down, there were always words given, and so the exact words to be written down are given to the prophet, and that's what God wants to go on to paper. And the reason for that is pretty obvious, is that God doesn't entrust his prophets to describe things themselves, because God has his own focus on things. If the prophets were to describe their own ideas, they would have a different focus, wouldn't match up with what God was wanting to do. So even right down to the word level, God dictates exactly what he wants the prophet to say or to write down. And there's obvious reasons, other obvious reasons for that, really. So in most cases, the prophecy is just words, just a whole bunch of words, maybe a page or maybe multiple pages of that. And you can also see sometimes in prophecy it comes in a series. There will be one prophecy here and then another one that came after that one in sequence, and so that often happens too. But they're blocks of text essentially stuck in the memory of the prophet. And in a few prophecies, but very few, less than people realize for prophecies, there have been images that go along with the prophecy. And in these cases, the words were always accompanying the images. It was never left to the prophet to describe what he was saying. Although sometimes, especially in Revelation, it looks like the prophet is describing what he's seeing. He isn't. He is giving out the words that God gave him to give. And in a later topic, I'm going to cover that. So the prophet's experience here, as we've seen so far, is that suddenly he knew a message word for word. It was just stuck in there as though he had memorized it, but he had never written it. He had never seen it before. It was entirely new to him. And that's an experience none of us have. And so how would you even say, here is something that just appeared in my head? Like I talked about poetry before, you know how that poetry got into your head. You memorized it earlier in your life, and it's there, or at least parts of it are still there. And you can go back to that and read that back to somebody if they want to hear what you remember. But it's a little bit different for the prophet in that it's just suddenly appeared as a big block of text, a whole complicated, as many prophecies are, set of text, and it is stuck in his memory forever. And as I've talked about before, the size of these, sometimes they are very large prophecies up to the size of Revelation. But there's also evidence that some of them were quite short prophecies. And so it was a different experience for those. Um, and most people have a misunderstanding of the way some prophecies work. They think that the prophet is describing a little discourse that the prophet is having with God. That happens much more rarely than you think. And people think that because it looks like that on paper. But when you really think about it, that isn't what's happening. And if you think you know of examples where that is happening, go and have a look about that and think about that when you're reading it in from the prophet. You'll find out that in most cases that isn't what's happening there. And Habakkuk is actually a really good example of that. Habakkuk appears to be a discourse between the prophet and God, as though he's questioning God about things and God is responding to him. But that isn't at all what's happening there. And you can tell the way it starts. He starts just like Isaiah did. These are the words that God gave me. I saw this prophecy. It just was in my head. And then he goes on with this huge couple chapters of prophecy. So Habakkuk, although it appears to be a discourse, it is not a discourse. You're not at all seeing the prophet's words. You're only seeing God's words on the page, except for the very first verse of introduction. So that's an important thing to understand, is that a lot of prophecies look like they're a discourse, but they're not. It's all God's words. And another thing that's interesting is the prophecies had individual styles to match the prophet. And God has delivered to the prophecy in a style that is natural to the prophet, is maybe the way to say that. So even though God was the author of the prophecy, he has styled it so that it's going to be a good thing for that prophet to deliver to other people or to write on page. And so he's matched perhaps the level of understanding of the prophet about particular things. Maybe he's matched the way the prophet likes to speak and is comfortable speaking. So maybe he made it that way to be easier to deliver to people when he's speaking to people, this prophecy. So you can see that very much, that every prophet has their own style. And this is God again. It isn't the prophet's own personal style being injected by the prophet. It is God injecting the prophet's style into the prophecy that God gives the prophet. Yeah, that's complicated. Just think about it a little bit. But so the different styles that we see in prophecy are not the cause or not caused by the prophet. That is God's handiwork as well. And so sometimes God gave explicit instructions about who should be given a message. And this is another aspect of how the prophet would deliver the prophecy he got, and the necessity of having it as a stuck in his long-term memory. And so God would sometimes say, write down this prophecy. But sometimes he would say, I want you to go from town to town and tell all these people. And so that would be a long period of time that the prophet would have to go from town to town, traveling from one town to another. And he would deliver the same prophecy to every town that he went to see. And it was, of course, necessary that that prophecy be exactly the same. And so he would do much like we saw with Jeremiah. It was in his memory because God had downloaded it into his memory. And Jeremiah would just have to speak those words from memory as though he had memorized them, but he never had. So, but sometimes the prophet was to write it down to become part of the Bible, and we talked about that with Jeremiah being a good example there. But in many cases, the prophecies were not written down. They were just God wanted them delivered to a particular person. And in fact, I'm quite certain that there would have been many prophecies that aren't mentioned anywhere, where God would just say to the prophet, I want you to go to Sam down the street and tell him this. And we see something kind of like that with Jeremiah and the death of his wife. He is told a day in advance that his wife is going to die the next day. So I imagine that it's likely that God would send prophets on little trips like that, where they're just to go down the street or to another neighborhood and deliver a message to a particular person. And those would never have been written down. They weren't for that purpose. They were just for a particular person at a particular time. And so those kind of prophecies are lost to us, and they wouldn't have been any good to us anyway. They were meant for a person at a particular time. So from all that we've talked about here, the quality of the prophecy can be determined, and from what we've seen here, we see that the prophecies that we read, were written exactly the way God intended, word for word, as the Spirit gave them to the prophet. So the Spirit was the one who delivered that into the prophet's memory, and it stuck in the prophet's memory. And we know it was rock solid there, especially from Jeremiah, but others as well. And so we can be absolutely certain that the prophecies that were written on paper are exactly word for word what God had wanted them to be. And that shouldn't be any surprise to us, really. We should never have been thinking along the lines that the prophet might have been injecting his own ideas or his own thoughts and describing things in his own ways. That would never be what God would want. And so, and you can look at that, at the prophecies, and many of them, you can see things in the prophecy that you can't imagine that the prophet himself could have ever come up with. And these are things like multiple meanings for words, where God uses a word that has two different meanings, but he employs the word in such a way that both meanings are correct. And there are lots of places in prophecy where that happens. Also, multiple fulfillments. That was, as far as we know, not an idea that prophets understood, but there are many prophets that have multiple fulfillments, which mean they are actually talking about um, very similar events that happen at different times. And so each one of those events is another fulfillment of that same prophecy. I'm sure I'll do an episode on that sometime in the future. And so we can also see that from the structure that they have, and that's the way that their words are arranged. There's a lot of information hidden in those structural ways, how paragraphs have been written, how they are blocked out in different ways. And I'm sure I'll probably have a message on that one in the future as well. But in some cases, there are prophecies that are very heavy in structure, and you can understand somewhat of being said by just looking at the words, but not until you really break down the structure of how this is all organized and how it all relates to each other, you can't understand the fullness of that prophecy. And just off the top of my head, Isaiah chapter 2 is a really good example of that. It is a very complicated structurally prophecy, and there's more to it the more you dig. And so those kind of depth and structure things are something that we see that we can't imagine that a prophet would have ever been able to come up with himself, and it just wouldn't make any sense for him to have done that. But and nonetheless, we have that prophecy, and we know that it was God's words intended for us to be reading and to be understanding as God revealed it to people. So I hope that clears up some things and gives you an idea that we can indeed trust prophecy. The prophecies that we were given were written down correctly. The question becomes a little less certain that they've traveled over time exactly the way they were intended. But for the Old Testament prophecies, there's good evidence that those have gotten to us without any real significant distortion of any sort. New Testament, that's a little less certain there. Nonetheless, we know that they were originally written correctly on paper so that they would be delivered to us.